Okay, Chapter 3. This is the real estate license law and the Florida Real Estate Commission rules that we're going to be dealing with. To begin with, I've already mentioned the Florida Real Estate Commission as being made up of 7 members. Also, let me say this, that Florida Statute 475 is the real estate license law. And those are the Florida legislature has created that in order to regulate the real estate industry. The Real Estate Commission is made up of 7 individuals. 5 of these individuals are licensees, 2 are not. They're laypersons. So the composition, there's 7 members. Of the 5 members that are licensees, 4 have got to be brokers and have been brokers for the last 5 years. That last slot, however, can be held by any license status. That is to say, it could be held by a real estate sales associate, a broker associate, or a broker. They only have to hold that position for the last 2 years. So if you saw a test question that said, what's the minimum requirement for a broker on the commission? It could be 2 years, just to let you know. Members of the commission are appointed by the governor of the state of Florida for a term of 4 years. Those terms, they cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. That is to say, 2 consecutive 4-year terms. They can serve more than the 8 years, but not in consecutive terms. As far as the overall powers of the Real Estate Commission, there are the executive powers, which is basically to regulate, the quasi-legislative, which is to make rules, and then the quasi-judicial is the enforcement of those rules. And when you see the word quasi, that means it's something similar to our legislative system or our judicial system. Also, let me say this, in order for them to create rules or to hand down discipline, there has to be a quorum. And for the Real Estate Commission, that means there has to be at least 4 members present. Regarding the Division of Real Estate, we've already talked about that. The Division of Real Estate is part of the Department of Business and Professional Regulation. The Department of Business and Professional Regulation is located in Tallahassee, Florida. The Division of Real Estate, however, by and large, is located in Orlando, Florida, where the Florida Real Estate Commission meets every month. As far as the license, there are 2 license status that we're going to be dealing with. One is an active status and the other is an inactive status. I mentioned earlier that as a sales associate, your initial issue from a licensing standpoint is going to be a voluntary inactive status. So in order for you to activate your license, you're going to have to place it with either a broker or an unlicensed employer. Let's talk about now the difference between voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary obviously is something that you do because you want to. Involuntary is your license becomes inactive not because of something that you want, but because of something that you did. And there's a couple of ways that this can happen. To begin with, if you fail to renew your license during your continuing education cycles, instead of your license becoming null and void, your license will simply become involuntary inactive. Now, you can remain involuntary inactive for up to 2 years, then it becomes void. The other way that your license can become involuntary inactive is that if that broker that you're working for has his or her license either suspended or revoked. That's an act of FREC, by the way, suspension or revocation. Then all the license under it will become involuntary inactive. Regarding license renewal for Air Force members and some of the exemptions that they have, if a person has a real estate license and then is inducted into the military, they can place their license voluntarily inactive and are exempt from any of the licensing requirements, such as continuing education, etc. And they can do that, and that exemption is going to be good for up to 6 months after their military stay is over. Now, regarding the different types, you have an effective license and you have an ineffective license. Obviously, an effective license is good to go, that you can either be active or inactive. The ineffective license means something has happened to it. It means you have a license, but you can't use it. And there are a number of ways that this can happen. To begin with, a license can be canceled anytime that a broker either resigns or unfortunately may die. That leaves kind of a void because every brokerage operation has to have a broker that is behind it, that causes it to function. If that broker is no longer there, the license are going to be canceled, but here's the deal. When we're talking about a broker who either resigns or dies or forgets to renew their license, typically speaking, if it's a partnership or if it's a corporation, those business entities have up to 14 days to replace that broker, and nothing's going to happen. But once that 14 days is gone, then all the license under it will be canceled. As far as suspended, the Florida Real Estate Commission, as part of their disciplinary process, has the ability to be able to suspend real estate licensee's license up to 10 years. Involuntary inactive, we've already mentioned, and by the way, involuntary inactive is a very important concept. Remember, we said that anytime that your broker either has their license either suspended or revoked, everybody's license under it becomes what? Involuntary inactive. Also, if you fail to renew your license during the continuing ed renewal periods, your license becomes involuntary inactive. Another way that your license can basically not work is that it can cease to be enforced. And let me tell you what happens when this happens. Anytime that a broker moves his or her main office, they have to notify the Division of Real Estate within 10 days of that move, or else all the license will cease to be enforced. So therefore, and by the way, if you change brokers, if you go from one broker to the next, the same thing applies. Your broker has 10 days to register you with that new brokerage. If not, your license will cease to be enforced. As far as void license are concerned, when you hear the word void, that means it doesn't exist anymore. There's two ways that can happen. A license can either be revoked. Revocation is an act of the Florida Real Estate Commission. Revocation is permanent. Or your license can simply expire. If you don't do your post-license education or you don't renew your continuing ed after your 2 years of involuntary inactive, it'll become null and void. It'll expire. Let's talk about multiple license. Only a broker can have multiple license. I'm a real estate broker, and I'm the broker for 2 or 3 companies right now. I'm allowed to have multiple license as a broker. Sales associates and broker associates cannot have multiple license. What an associate can have is something called a group license. Remember, I mentioned earlier that you have the ability to be able to go to work for an unlicensed employer. When you go to work for that unlicensed employer, just remember that that employer has to register with the Division of Real Estate as somebody that's unlicensed. And I also mentioned that whatever time that you spend with that broker or that unlicensed employer does not count toward the time that you need to become a broker. If that unlicensed employer has more than one project going on, because remember, you're limited to only their stuff. You can only sell their stuff. But they may have a partnership with somebody else. As long as the same underlying owner is there, that unlicensed employer, you can obtain a group license and be able to work at different facilities. And that is about all there is to that particular chapter. Now, why don't we review that real quick? There are 7 members to the Florida Real Estate Commission. 5 are licensed and 2 are unlicensed. Each FREC member is appointed by the governor with confirmation by the state senate, not legislature, the state senate. And each term is for 4 years. And remember, they can't serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Involuntary inactive can occur when you fail to renew or your employing broker has his or her license either suspended or revoked by the Florida Real Estate Commission. A broker who fails to notify the DBPR of an office move within 10 days, that license and all license will cease to be in force. A group license is held by an associate working for an unlicensed employer. A multiple license is held by a broker for more than one real estate brokerage. If a broker dies or resigns, all licenses are canceled. But remember, if it's a corporation or partnership, they have 14 days to replace that broker before that cancellation occurs. The initial issue for sales associates is going to be a voluntary inactive status. There's a 28-hour reactivation course that's going to be required for anybody who's involuntary inactive in the last 2 years of that involuntary inactive period. And that's the end of that particular review.